You take the case of the last war in Lebanon. A lot of Israel's artillery happened to have been located near Arab villages in Israel. And then the question became whether it was intentional or they were simply deploying artillery in the available areas. Hard to tell. So number one, a lot of the language is ambiguous. Number two, Palestine, Israel, are the most heavily monitored area in the world by human rights organizations. They're the big organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and then there's this whole slew of local organizations, each of which churns out one report after another. It's very difficult to keep up with. But you would assume so many different organizations, so many different research staffs, you would assume there are going to be differences of opinion about what's actually happening. And then number three, a lot of human rights work is just very vulnerable to human error. Because what is human rights work? It's somebody going out into the field, observing the demonstration, and trying to figure out, did the Palestinians initiate the clash? And if they did they use stones or live ammunition? And did the Israelis initiate the clash? And if they did, were they in a life-threatening situation? And if they were, did they first fire warning shots? And then if they did, were they aiming at the legs, the torso, the head? In human rights work, that all makes a difference. And this is a sophisticated Brown University audience, so you all know the film Rashomon by Kurosawa. How many of you know it? That's very impressive. I'm very surprised. This is a sophisticated audience. Or you already know the young age how to lie. So for those of you who didn't raise your hands because of a certain respect for truth, the Rashomon is several people observing the same incident and then in retrospect remembering it altogether differently. And so you would expect that people observing the same demonstration would remember it differently. Or that's plausible. And one of my own surprises, and I do mean a surprise, I had gone through at one point, I was writing something, and I went through several thousands of pages of human rights reports over a 20-year period from the beginning of what's called the First Intifada in 1987 up until roughly 2005. And it was a huge amount of material to sift through, and I was genuinely surprised that literally, and I'm not fearful of a polygraph being put to my wrist at this moment, I was quite surprised that over a 20-year period, thousands of pages of reports from multiple human rights organizations, literally, I was able to find only one case of one demonstration on one afternoon in one city where two human rights organizations disagreed about what happened. And the point on which they disagreed happened to have been itself quite trivial. There's no dispute, no controversy about what this record shows. Okay, what does this all mean in concrete practical reality? Let's take the most common aspect, in my opinion not the most important, but certainly the one that's most salient, the question of fatalities during the Israel-Palestine conflict. As some of you know, January 2006, the Palestinian people, in a certified, internationally monitored election, elect the Islamic movement Hamas into power in the occupied territories. Immediately as they come to power, Israel, and then followed by the United States, impose these brutal economic sanctions among the Palestinian people, the justification being several-fold for our purposes now, the main claim being that Hamas is a terrorist organization, terrorism is illegal under international law, and that for the Palestinians to return to the community of civilized nations, their elected government has to renounce terrorism. And in fact, it seems to me that's pretty much a no-brainer. Terrorism is illegal under international law. Terrorism being the standard definition, the targeting of civilians to achieve a political goal or a political aim. And so there's no point in belaboring what it seems to me is obvious. Terrorism is illegal. The targeting of civilians to achieve a political goal is immoral and illegal. So there's no point, as I said, to belaboring it, and it would be, in my opinion, obtuse to quarrel about it. No qualifications apart from the obvious one. Namely, if you apply a principle across the board to all parties to a conflict, it's a moral or legal principle. But if you only apply it to one party to the conflict, it ceases to be a moral or legal principle. It becomes, as everyone in this room knows, a hypocritical principle. And so, trying as we would want to at an institution of higher learning committed to principles of truth and justice, let's apply the principle across the board and see what the record looks like. Let's start with the raw material. The second Intifada begins September 2000. If you look at the numbers up until today, about 4,700 Palestinians have been killed and about 1,000 Israelis have been killed. So strictly in terms of numbers, the ratio is now about 4.7 to 1 in terms of fatalities. That's, as they say, the first level of analysis. The second level of analysis is, of course, not to look at total numbers of fatalities, but to look at numbers of fatalities who are civilian on both sides, because according to the laws of war, it's legitimate to target combatants. So we look at the number of civilians killed. It's about, the ratio is about 3 to 4 Palestinians killed for each Israeli killed. So, we're again looking at the second level of analysis. It's still, the imbalance is quite pronounced against the Palestinians. Nonetheless, there's still a third level of analysis, which those of you who in the audience who are more acute, not to mention disturbed by my remarks, would want to make. And the third level of analysis, in my opinion, is perfectly legitimate. Namely, isn't there a difference between Palestinians targeting Israeli civilians and Israel unintentionally killing Palestinian civilians? That's the conventional argument that's made. We shouldn't sneer or snicker, I think. We should try to treat it seriously and see where it leads us. Or, you take the case of Jeffrey Goldberg, who was the New Yorker's correspondent in the occupied territories. I guess he's now with Atlantic magazine. In his recent book, I think he's only written one, in his book Prisoners, Jeffrey Goldberg has a very distinguished career. Before he was a correspondent for the New Yorker, he was a prison guard for Israel, which it seems to me is a perfect qualification for being a correspondent for the New Yorker. And by the way, a torturer. That's a fact. Mr. Goldberg, in his book Prisoners, he recounts an argument he had with a